Welcome everybody, good afternoon to you. Delighted to see such a good number of people coming along to the latest of our post-Brexit clinics. It's a busy day for those of us interested in Brexit, Northern Ireland and the protocol. I think it's fair to say it's a busier day than we anticipated when we set this date. We've obviously got this afternoon an expected EU announcement on extension of a grace period for meat products. We'll look forward to that coming through. We've had already today the ruling of Justice Colton in the Belfast High Court on the question of a judicial review of the protocol. And obviously the biggest event of the day was the publication of our latest report on the Lucid Talk opinion poll of Northern Ireland voters' views on the protocol and Brexit. Now, we're going to be touching on all of these issues this afternoon with you. As is the norm, we're going to each present a couple of slides to you and hopefully address a number of questions. And then once we've all finished, we'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. And as Kevin said, please do put those in the chat. Okay, I'll share some slides with you. I'm going to start off by saying a few words about the where we are with the implementation of the protocol and some of the issues ahead. Yeah. Okay. So if we think about where we are, since we last met with the Post-Brexit Clinic, we've had the initial judicial review hearing in the Belfast High Court. We've also had one joint committee meeting of the UK-EU, and what you see there in the block of text is a sense of the outstanding issues which exist between the UK and the EU on the implementation of the protocol. I think it's fair to say there's quite a number of those issues, many of which would have seen in news headlines and some of the discussions being reported in the press. Issues to do with the SPS regime, sanitary phytosanitary regime on goods moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, the operation of a trusted trade scheme, the question about the meat products and the end of the grace period, which is supposed to be today, issues around parcels, medicines, guide dogs, VAT, and the various compatibilities or incompatibilities between UK and EU systems. I suppose what's encouraging is that these issues are all being identified, they're all on the table, and there are ongoing discussions between officials on trying to find resolutions to those. The focus very much is on dialogue and trying to find solutions, which contrasts to the situation earlier this year when there was quite considerable politics between the UK and the EU, and relationships were quite tense. That's not to say that there aren't still tensions, because there are still quite significant differences of opinion on how some of these issues can be resolved. But at least the institutional framework is being used to try and address these. That's not to say that there isn't still politicking around. You've probably been aware that at the G7 meeting in Cornwall, the question of the protocol grabbed a number of headlines. And we see there a quote from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, indicating that he thinks we can sort things out, but it's up to our EU friends and partners to understand that we will do whatever it takes. And that if the protocol continues to be applied, he once again said, we will obviously not hesitate to invoke Article 16. Okay. Earlier in the year, when the UK wanted to extend the grace periods, it did so unilaterally. What's significant in the period since we last met is that the approach has shifted somewhat, such that the UK actually formally requested an extension to the end of the grace periods for meat products, which once again reinforces this idea that they want to, that both sides are engaging it through processes rather than acting unilaterally. And as it's got right down at the bottom there, we are expecting to see an extension of that grace period later today. What we've also seen, in addition to the joint committee meeting, is increased engagement between, or continued engagement between the UK and the EU with both civil society and business representatives, but also direct involvement of Maroš Šefčovič before the Northern Ireland Assembly's Committee for the Executive Office on Monday, where he gave evidence to it. Quite a novel situation. I suppose the question now is whether David Frost will do something similar. Okay, so quite an eventful period. We've got this grace period extension probably come this afternoon. We've also now had the judicial review outcome, and Billy's going to be talking about that in a moment. As far as I'm concerned, okay, we need to bear in mind, okay, that there's more to the implementation of the protocol than addressing the meats issue, which seems to be grabbing a lot of the headlines at the moment. And if there is an extension, it is only that. It's an extension probably of 3 months until the end of September, when not only will that meat products extension end, but so too will the existing grace periods on relating to parcels, which the UK unilaterally extended until the end of September, and also the grace period on the implementation of export health and other certificates being required for the movement of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And there's obviously quite a large number of legitimate concerns about the disruption that the end of these grace periods could cause if there aren't easements around the implementation of obligations. And there don't seem to be definitive solutions agreed between the UK and the EU yet on all those issues, particularly the SPS question, which Vivian will come back to later. And then we've got the end of the grace period at the end of the year around application of the Medicines Act key, which has grabbed a fair amount of attention, and on which the EU has indicated that it is willing to change EU law in order to agree arrangements for Northern Ireland. Slightly longer term, we've obviously got the Assembly elections, probably now more likely to be, as originally envisaged, in May next year rather than sooner. And those are obviously going to be really important in terms of the composition of the Assembly for that democratic consent vote in probably December 2024, when MLAs will be given the opportunity to determine whether Articles 5 to 10, essentially around the movement of goods, and therefore the question of where the border is, whether those provisions continue to apply. What's important, given the current narrative, particularly in Northern Ireland, about the protocol, is that vote is not one which allows for the protocol as a whole to be scrapped. It is simply on those Articles 5 to 10. They are obviously really important and central to the protocol, but the vote is not on the entirety of the protocol. Things to look out for in the coming months is whether we do get a regularisation of meetings of the joint and specialised committees and the Joint Consultative Working Group. Their activities have been a bit sporadic. They've not necessarily been regular. And I think certainly for those people who are interested in working out what's actually going on with the protocol and the UK-EU discussions around it, we could do with seeing more regular meetings and also a bit more transparency around what's happening in those meetings. Another question to come is whether the informal arrangements which have been put in place for consultation between Maroš Šefčovič and David Frost with business, with civil society groups, will actually be formalised and regularised, whether we will see regular participation of the likes of David Frost and Maroš Šefčovič in committee meetings of the Northern Ireland Assembly so that they can scrutinise what's happening with the protocol and presumably develop their understanding of it in advance of that vote in 2024. What we've also got in the background is what the EU will next do with the legal action it brought, or the legal procedures it initiated against the UK early this year for non-implementation of aspects of the protocol. I'm sure Billy will pick up on this in a moment. And then two other things we need to be thinking about as well is the extent to which the changes within the protocol resulting from replacements and amendments to EU law, what they're going to mean for Northern Ireland, for the movement of goods and any divergence between the UK and the EU. And that brings me to that fifth box on the bottom right-hand side is what we are probably moving closer now towards legislation coming forward on the part of the UK government, which will see regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU. And the question there is, how does that then impact on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland? And I suppose we should also mention as well, we saw agreements between the UK and Australia on a trade agreement, or at least the outlines of a trade agreement. There's probably going to be more of those coming through, and they are obviously going to have some implications for potentially the movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland under the terms of those trade agreements. So we're focusing at the moment on the extension of the grace periods. We're looking at the outcome of the judicial review hearing, but there's plenty of other issues ahead for the protocol, And I think it's fair to say we're on for quite a busy autumn as we move towards the end of those grace periods that I've got there at the top of the screen. Okay, so that's an overview from me. I'm going to hand over now to Billy, who is straight from studying the bits that we're getting out of the hike this morning. So Billy, over to you.
Hi everyone. Straight from studying is a bit of an exaggeration. I've basically looked at a few Twitter threads since the judgment is not out yet. When I agreed to speak about judicial review, we had no idea that the judgment would be delivered today. So it was always a bit of a hospital pass. But I'll try my best to give you guys an overview. So the last clinic we held, I tried to describe the overall picture with respect to judicial review of the protocol. So the different mechanisms for the judicial review of the protocol. And so this is a slightly amended slide that I used previously. And just to explain that when you're talking about judicial review of the protocol, there are really two main avenues. You have those mechanisms that are specifically envisaged in the withdrawal agreement. And so here we're talking about the state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, so the arbitration mechanism, and of course, the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice when it comes to matters relating to the application of EU law. And then beside that, you have, what's the main focus today, which is domestic judicial review procedures. So the judicial review mechanisms that are available under the internal legal orders of whether the EU or the UK. And you can see in the bottom that all these different boxes have been slowly filled in the past 6 months. So with respect to judicial review under the withdrawal agreement, we have, of course, the dispute relating to the UK's decision to unilaterally extend grace periods, right? So the European Commission has initiated the arbitration, the state-to-state dispute mechanism, arguing in particular that the UK's decision to unilaterally extend these grace periods amounted to a violation, a breach of the good faith requirement under the withdrawal agreement. And you've got an enforcement action, which was also initiated by the European Commission. And we're right now at the pre-litigation phase, the pre-judicial stage of these infringement proceedings. So we know that the European Commission sent a letter of formal notice to the United Kingdom, informing that it thinks it's violating EU law. And we've already seen reports that the UK has perhaps unsurprisingly disagreed with these allegations, and that the Commission was thinking of issuing now a reasoned opinion, which would be the next step where it would provide more detail in terms of the alleged violation and give the UK a time period within which it has to ensure compliance. Always worth bearing in mind that even if the UK does not comply with EU law in the eyes of the Commission, of course, within that time period, there is always a flexibility, there's always a margin of discretion for the Commission to decide whether or not it wants to take this case to court, right? So it may be that in a few weeks or months' time, we're still not before the European Court of Justice, hopefully because there's a solution that's been found to the dispute, but also the European Commission could decide that it's not politically desirable to go ahead. If it does go ahead, of course, then the ultimate aim is to get a declaration of illegality, and then further ahead, potentially financial sanctions that would be imposed on the UK. With respect to judicial review in the domestic legal orders, as far as I know, to my knowledge, there's already really been one dispute that's been brought before the Court of Justice, which is the McCourt dispute. This is an application which is seeking damages against the Commission for its, you'll remember, its botched attempt to trigger Article 16 of the protocol, the safeguard provision, in order to impose export restrictions relating to COVID vaccines. I think there's a broad consensus that that application isn't going anywhere because the applicants will fail the standing requirements, not least because they're challenging a measure which never, doesn't produce legal effect, which never came into effect. Then beyond that, you've got our main focus today, which is of course UK judicial review procedures. Again, we have multiple applications that are ongoing. I've listed here the ones that have been recently reported. Of course, we've got the Habib dispute, and which led to judgment today. You've got the Blair International application, which is about seeking damages. So again, the argument here is that the protocol is unlawful, and then so businesses that are involved in trade, east-west trade, have been adversely affected by this illegality, and they're seeking damages from the UK government. So here we're talking in both Habib and Blair International, we're talking about two disputes where the challenge is against the legality of the protocol under UK law. But there are the disputes which challenge the legality of measures adopted by UK public authorities in light of the protocol. So, for example, we've seen reports of an application from a member of Sinn Féin against the ministerial decision not to build the border control posts. You can move the slides, David. Thank you. So we've got a ruling today in the Habib case. So again, I've not seen the judgment, right? So I'm not going to venture and provide you with any hot takes on this. This is very technical constitutional law, so really it will take a few days, maybe even weeks to go through the judgment and understand exactly what was said. I'll just give you a very broad overview of this dispute and what the claims were. So again, oversimplifying it, the challenge was that the protocol was in violation of the acts of the union, and in particular that the government had made the protocol by using the royal prerogative in a manner that was contrary to statutes. And so the statute here, of course, acts of the union, and in particular, the requirement that the subjects of Her Majesty the Queen be entitled to the same privileges, so her subjects in Ireland and in Great Britain. And of course, underlying that was this idea that the protocol has placed Northern Ireland within the EU Customs Union in a completely different trade and customs regime. And so there is a level of differential treatment here where Northern Ireland is not in the same footing as the rest of the United Kingdom. Based on the reports, it's clear that the High Court was not convinced by this argument and found that the EU Withdrawal Act of 2020 is impliedly repealed, the active constitution in this area. It was always an argument that was unlikely to succeed, because really, if you take the argument to its natural conclusion, even devolution would be problematic, because any differential treatment, regulatory or trade, would mean that Northern Ireland is not on the same footing as the rest of the UK. And we know, of course, that there were already barriers to trade, east-west trade, before Brexit, before the protocol. The other argument, which was a bit more interesting, was the one based on Article 18, paragraph 2 of the protocol. So that's the democratic consent mechanism. And the argument here is especially based on Belfast Agreement and Section 42 of the Northern Ireland Act. So this is the petitions of concern. So the idea that if you have 30 or more assembly members who express a concern, then you need a cross-community vote. And of course, Section 42 would not apply with respect to the democratic consent mechanism created in the protocol. So that's also an argument that's been rejected by the High Court. Related to that was, we heard during the hearings that there was a claim that there was a breach of EU law, in particular Article 10 of the Treaty on European Union, which governs the principle of democracy under EU law. And so again, the idea here would be that by subjecting Northern Ireland to EU law, EU rules, a trading regime, a regulatory regime, without giving Northern Ireland a say in the decision-making process, that would be an undemocratic outcome, which would be contrary to EU law, to the EU treaties. Again, we have to look at the details in the judgment to see the extent to which this argument was addressed. But, to cut a story short, the case has been dismissed, but we really have to look at the judgment in a bit more detail to understand the specifics of the rationale for the decision. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much, Billy. Over to Katie.
Thank you, David. So you mentioned at the beginning there about the poll that we conducted through Lucid Talk, and this is the second one. In our previous Brexit clinic, we presented you with the results from the one that we conducted in mid-March. So I'm just going to very briefly give you the headline findings from those, and Lisa will talk about the comments that were added, which were really interesting. So essentially, I mean, the overall, we see that there hasn't been much movement since the March poll, which is quite interesting given how much has happened in political terms since then, even though, as David says, we haven't had much movement at the UK-EU level. We note that still our respondents, we're pleased to say, I think they have a good understanding of the protocol. 7 out of 10 say they do, even though they have doubts about the reliable information that's available on it. Please point them to our website. And then we come to the questions around opinions, actually, around Brexit and the protocol. And what we see here is a very clear even split pretty much between those who think that the protocol is appropriate and on balance good for NI and those who disagree with that. And so one small change since the March poll is that we have a growth from those who are undecided on the point or neutral on it towards those saying that they disagree that the protocol is on balance good. But generally here we see that even split between respondents on that question. This is aside from the fact that, or despite the fact that 2/3 think that particular arrangements for Northern Ireland were always going to be necessary coming out of Brexit. It's just the discussion is whether if the protocol is appropriate or not. Next slide, please. And then we ask the questions around levels of concern. And we have this about Brexit and the protocol because it's difficult to disaggregate those. You can see from those red bars, it's quite clear levels of concern are high from people of all different backgrounds and perspectives. Notably, of the questions that we asked, people are least worried about the very fact of checks and controls, GB to NI, but nonetheless, those levels of concern are still high. And still, as with the last poll, people are, 3/4 of people are worried that Northern Ireland's voice is not being heard and worried about the scrutiny of the decision-making that is happening at the Joint Committee and Specialised Committee level. And then the big question is, well, given the significance of the protocol for NI, given the range of concerns that people have about it, who do you trust to manage Northern Ireland's interests in this area? The standout group that is trusted are the business reps, and that's the same as we found in the last poll. In fact, they've gone up. The levels of trust have gone up in them. So they're obviously doing something right. The UK government levels of distrust are exactly the same as they were in the past polls at 86%. And we see that when it comes to the EU on the other side, the EU or the EU Commission, levels of trust in them are significantly higher than they are for the British government at 40%, but we still see that those who distrust them outnumber those who trust them. The same is true of the Irish government. And then in response to points that were raised in the Brexit clinic and then in the comments as well, we asked about different parties and levels of trust in them. The levels of distrust in the DUP are very high, particularly we see there people strongly distrust them even more than they strongly distrust the British government. But levels of distrust in Sinn Féin are also high, at 6 out of 10. And then the Alliance Party and the SDLP are doing rather better, as is the UUP. Notably, a lot of people are still to make up their minds about where the UUP stands and all of this, and perhaps the UUP is itself. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, the questions of where the parties stand on the protocol and what detailed positions they're going to have on it are, of course, important, because we see that 8 out of 10 of our respondents say that that a candidate's position on the protocol will affect whether they cast a vote for them. As David mentioned, that consent vote at the end of 24 is very much in people's minds. It is remarkable that 91% of people say that they do have an interest with how their MLA votes on that topic. Again, this is probably something we couldn't have anticipated this time last year. And then again, you see that even split coming forward. So 45% don't want continued application of Articles 5 to 10 and 46% who do. So we see here it's very much a divisive matter, and one that a lot of people think is hugely politically significant. So I'll hand over now to Lisa to talk you through some of the comments that were given.
Thank you, Katie. And yeah, so as Katie mentioned, alongside the structured questions, the survey allowed participants to contribute some comments on either the survey, the Northern Ireland Protocol, or the current Northern Ireland issues in politics. This was an optional entry, so unlike the quantitative findings, any responses aren't weighted and therefore can't be taken as representative. That said, or in this survey, we received over 500, so 544 substantive comment responses about the topics covered from the initial unweighted sample of 2,630. So that means about 21% of respondents have provided often really quite detailed comments. And this is an unusually high level of engagement with this kind of optional invitation for comment. And that can be said to underline just the extent to which people here are exercised by these issues and the topic. From the perspective of research, a high number of responses also means that analysing the themes that come through in that bank of comments can really help contextualise the quantitative findings and give us a richer overall picture of people's views. So what you see on the screen is a list of the top 10 themes that came through in the set of comments from this survey. And I'll just highlight a couple of things. So as in the March poll, the most frequently occurring theme in the written comments is that the protocol is viewed as necessary or inevitable, potentially beneficial, and therefore should be made to work, with 149 comments reflecting that view. It's quite interesting to see that this is, again, the top theme, as respondents with this perspective tend to have quite nuanced views of the protocol, and express it in kind of qualified terms, describing it as a least worst option and or as a potentially positive thing for Northern Ireland if it can be depoliticised and or implemented rationally. The top two themes aren't mutually exclusive, so some of the 116 respondents who hold a negative view of the protocol also think it is potentially beneficial and or should be made to work. However, unsurprisingly, considering the quantitative findings and the current political debate, many who hold a negative view of the protocol express it in unequivocal and often extremely strong terms. That strength of feeling of those who are wholly opposed to the protocol is then reflected in the 7th most common theme coming through of 77 respondents who are calling for the protocol or the Irish Sea border to be scrapped in their written entries. Findings about low levels of trust in the UK government and the DUP in particular are reflected in the 3rd and 4th most frequently occurring themes. So 91 respondents commenting to criticise the UK government's handling of Brexit and the protocol and related issues, and 115 to criticise mainly the DUP, but also civic and or political unionism more generally. Negative views on Brexit also come through, both in explicit descriptions of Brexit as being unwise or badly handled, with 80 respondents articulating this view. or interestingly, this theme is newer compared to the March poll. So 58 respondents stating that Brexit is the cause of disruption in and for Northern Ireland rather than the protocol. Another interesting finding is that there's a significant increase in the number of respondents who express concern about the lack of reliable information or express concern about the prevalence of misinformation about the protocol. So in our first poll in March, there were only 19 comments that addressed that view, and here we had 87. So just on the next slide, David, thanks. These are just some examples reflecting four of the top 5 themes, just to give you a flavour of some of the nuance and detail and the tone that comes through. As you can see, the top left, the protocol as necessary or potentially beneficial. Here we see that idea of the protocol being an unfortunate outworking of Brexit, and the statement that it is okay in principle, but needs mitigations to make it nearly invisible and therefore avoid political stability. So again, kind of complexity in those in the opinion. By contrast, in the top right, an example of a strongly negative view of the protocol, the participant viewing it as an imposition, as being imposed on Northern Ireland, feeling disenfranchised from a place which makes laws for us, i.e. the EU, and therefore this sense of being a second-class UK citizen. On the bottom left, we have a strong critique of the UK government, the idea that the government was quoting, well aware of the problems that would arise, but thought that they could sign the agreement and renege on it, and while blaming the EU. So quite a strength of feeling. And finally, on the bottom right, a perspective on the lack of reliable or unbiased information and a concern about politicization of the protocol into a green or orange issue. So hopefully that gives you a flavour. And just the last thing I'd say, to reiterate that the comments section are not representative, but it does fit in the ethos of kind of testing the temperature of opinion in Northern Ireland on the protocol, and that really unusually high number of responses, the breadth and the nuance of views that are reflected in those responses does suggest that there's at least some consensus out there about the significance of the protocol and reactions to it in Northern Ireland. That was my attempt to end on a positive, and I'll pass over to Vivian, I think, to run through agri-food stuff.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. I think just to tell participants, we have launched the findings of the poll online, and they will be available from the website, and we'll put the link into the chat as we go through the meeting. Okay, Vivian, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so back to managing the agri-food side of things. On the protocol, what we have here is, if you want to move on, next slide, David. Not sure. Yeah. Is my camera working? Or because I'm still seeing you, David.
Are you? I've got the screen up.
I can see you, Vivian.
Okay. That's fine. So just a reminder of why SPS matters. So SPS, we've heard that the business groups are some of the most trusted on this. Heard earlier in the year, or even last year, they identify 5 Ps of pets, plants, seed potatoes, plant products, and parcels, where we needed grace periods to adapt. And a lot of these are to do with SPS. So SPS stands for sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And these are measures that are adopted to protect animal or plant life, protect human or animal life. So it's all to do with food and movement of animals as well. Plants will be also covered. So it's very much critical when it comes to the type of checks we're seeing sprouting in Belfast Harbour, for example. These are especially important as well currently in the debate. Now, that doesn't mean that, as David rightly pointed out, these are not the only grace periods that matter. These are not the only areas where divergence between GB, Northern Ireland, and the EU will matter going forward. But for now, we are only mostly talking about sausages. Now, next slide. There are 2 basic options that are being discussed in terms of removing most of these checks and making it easier to move goods both from GB to Northern Ireland and from GB to the EU. Because currently what we've got this grace period that theoretically later today, will be extended until the end of September. But since since the end of the transition, British sausages have not been able to go on the EU market. There's just been a grace period for GB to NI, but there has been no flexibility on GB to EU. These two options, equivalence or alignment, would not just have an impact on GB to NI, they'll have a critical impact as well on GB to EU. And actually, I think that's where, I mean, of course, we want, de-dramatization of the situation here. But if you are a small producer in Great Britain, you'll be even more interested if you can, trade again with your chilled meats products into the whole European market and not just into Northern Ireland. Now, what are the options? So equivalence is something that the EU has, for example, with USA, Canada, New Zealand. It has actually not done much. It's really rule by rule agreement. You have to have this kind of agreement that these rules have equivalent ambition. And so every time that one of the party changes their rules, you have to have another process to determine whether these are equivalent or not. We've had quite a narrow understanding of equivalence. So the further, the closer the rules are, the easier it has been to find equivalence. And actually, in many cases, it hasn't been found. Critically, it is reciprocal, so it would cover trade in both directions. It does not, though, mean absence of checks. You still have lots of checks. You can be spot checks, but there's an agreement between parties on frequency of checks, and the checks are also, against your domestic rules. So this equivalence, which I guess in the public debate on this has been called more kind of a New Zealand type of deal, would reduce the number of checks, would perhaps, but it would not remove the need for checks. So if you want to remove the need for most of these checks, if not all of the SPS checks, what you want is alignment, which is what the Swiss have with, for example, the Swiss EU veterinary agreement. And here the idea is every time the EU changes its SPS rules, Switzerland changes their rules as well, so that you've got this kind of dynamic alignment between Switzerland and the EU. This is not reciprocal. It is about Switzerland following EU rules. This allows basically a common market where you have EU border control posts that will check shipment from non-EU countries going to Switzerland as they enter the EU, and then they can travel freely. Critically, you do have some divergence remaining possible. For example, Switzerland does actually allow some import of hormone-treated US beef, which the EU does not, and that can flow into the EU for Switzerland. Next slide, David. Now, I mean, we're hearing a lot about the need to de-dramatize, to de-escalate. And actually, I mean, when we look at the Swiss situation, of course, there's an issue, a theoretical issue here about the idea of just adopting EU rules. Critically, the UK is in a very different situation than the Swiss, in that the UK created these rules together with the EU. So the idea that aligning with the EU on SPS would be being bound by EU rules, external EU rules, is a bit counterintuitive, because actually the UK shaped these rules. The UK's current rules are the EU rules. So how do you then try to flip this? What we have seen and solve the issues. Short term, what we're going to see is a further 3 months delay. So an extension again on the grace period. We're hopefully going to see similar extensions on other problematic issues such as medicine. What's critical there, though, that these grace periods are not about saying, don't worry about implementing the rules. It's about giving the supermarkets, businesses, the time to adapt their supply chain so that they don't need to rely on GB chilled meat imports. a lot of supermarkets and businesses around Northern Ireland have already done that. I can see a question here, if we all become vegans, would that help? It would, definitely. You would not have to care too much about chilled meat imports if we don't eat meat. It's definitely one of the solutions, which I have not flagged on this slide. Midterm, what you can do is having an SPS agreement. Now, there's been a lot of discussion there, especially around the Switzerland agreement. Some politicians considering that it is definitely the way to go, others saying it's completely impossible to even continents. What's critical here is that currently we're in a session where we're in a situation where, you know, we have not, the UK is basically paying the costs for divergence without actually having any of the potential benefits of divergence. We are keeping on using the same rules, but actually being, having to go through checks as if we're using different rules. So the obvious solution is just to adopt in SPS, a temporary SPS agreement, until the UK has actually decided to diverge, such as, for example, after a UK-US trade deal. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that it would then recast any kind of future trade deal into a decision. Does this trade deal, does the benefit of this trade deal outweigh the cost of reimposing, checks between GB and Northern Ireland? And that's why I would assume that actually the UK government is not very happy with this suggestion of an SPS agreement. But in the long term, we basically know that we are going to have this alignment. The UK will end up having to align either with the US or the EU. The UK's economy is not big enough for it to be a third kind of big regulatory player. So the question is then, the UK will have to make that choice. And of course, if the UK decides to align with the US, then we will come back to these checks. So in any case, I think businesses around Northern Ireland should be very careful about trying to source alternatives to GB products, because if we have a UK-US trade deal, then they will be back to having to use these alternative supply chains. And that's all for me.
Okay, thanks very much, Vivian. We now move to some of the questions. And as I said earlier, if you want to put the questions in the chat, that would be most useful. Equally, if so we'll take some of those there. We've got, I think, a question there initially from George to all of us. Is there any analysis of the intergenerational differences in the polling?
Yes, I've just done some there now, George, just for you. And so I'm happy to say, I'll see if, I don't know if I can share my screen. No, I can't share my screen, but so I'll just talk you through. So I've just looked up there on whether the protocol is overall a good thing. And I would say there is a risk when you look by these kind of categories that they become less stable. But anyway, what we can see is that the only age group where the protocol is seen as very much a good thing is age 25 to 44. So that's saying 37% of those disagree that it's good and 54% say it is good. And then for the other age groups, that's 18 to 24, 45 to 64 and 65 plus, it seems to be in the other direction. That's just over 50% actually say that disagree that it's a good thing, and around 35 to 39% thinking it is a good thing. And that's particularly true. Those who are disagreeing most about the protocol being a good thing is interestingly in the young age group, which is not necessarily what you might have expected. And then in terms of whether, I also looked at the question of whether Brexit is overall a good thing. And those aged 25 to 64, over 60% are saying that it's not a good thing. They disagree about that on that point. And then we have around 50% of those aged 18 to 24 and then over 65 who disagree that Brexit is overall a good thing. And then you can work out what the alternatives are there. So I hope that helps.
Okay. Thanks, Katie. I think that the next question we got in there is from Michael Darcy, and I think it's aimed at you, Vivian. Isn't US President Biden's offer ahead of the G7 to do special deal to protect protocol arrangements on agri-food in a US-UK FTA also very significant?
I don't remember the detail of Biden's promises there. So, but basically, I mean, as the protocol allows for checks, GB to NI anyway, you could understand that protecting protocol arrangements would just be that the food part of a UK-US deal would not apply to Northern Ireland. And that's a very simple way of protecting the protocol and also getting a deal. And that would actually then lead to increased deals, like increased checks, but within the that are perfectly understandable and prepared for within the protocol. So I think, I mean, we know, I mean, if Michael knows more about the details of Biden's promises, please like add them in the chat. But I think we need to be very careful there that we have, I mean, first promises before a very long trade negotiation, I think we can take with a big pinch of salt. And second, we know that, I mean, the trade agreement would have to be supported through the Congress, and we know that there's going to be a tension there between kind of US, Irish, you know, the kind of Irish side in the Congress and the kind of farmer side, where there's going to be a push both for protecting the protocol, but also for finally getting into the UK market.
Maybe I can come in on this.
Yes, please.
If you don't mind. Yeah. I think the promise or the commitment that was made by Biden is that no trade agreement between the UK or the US would require the UK to comply with rules or regulatory standards, which would be problematic from a protocol perspective. So the way I had understood it, and maybe others might have a different take on it, is that there would be no commitments included in the US-UK trade agreement, which would require the UK to comply with UK-type regulatory standards, which would then, of course, create additional barriers to trade between Northern Ireland and GB. So that's how I understood it. But I think the point I wanted to make is, I mean, I made my PhD some time ago about deep trade agreements, right? And so the term deep is about regulatory standards, regulatory components that are included in trade agreements. And I'm yet to find a single US trade agreement which requires its trading partners to comply with its standards in the way that's being talked about in the context of the UK. So I've always found that this whole discussion surrounding the US trade deal quite funny and surreal, really, because we're talking about the US signing a trade agreement which would be unprecedented with the US. My suspicion is that the US trade agreement is being used as a pretext for the UK not to sign an SPS agreement type, which would require some sort of dynamic regulatory alignment. Because quite simply, there are no trade agreements. Once you take you put the EU aside as a trade agreement, there are no trade agreements in contemporary trade policy which would require that level of alignment.
Okay, thanks, Billy. I see Michael's put in a comment there. I make the point to highlight that this US offer would underpin, protect the integrity of the UK food safety on the island for both consumers and for producers.
But just to get back on this, I don't think the question is about what happens on this island. And I mean, it's great to have US commitments on this, but what matters is, especially in this discussion, is what can go from GB to NI. And of course, the further divergence there is, the more you need checks. And I mean, to jump back on what Billy was saying, I mean, I don't think the idea is that the UK would wholly kind of adopt US rules. It's just that they would allow, and we've seen this discussions around, around all the different bills, around the Agricultural Act, the Environmental Bill, the Trade Bill, around the decision by the UK government to not say that, to refuse to state legally that they would not allow products that do not meet domestic standards on the UK market. And I think that's where, because then if you do have hormone-fed US beef entering, like being so legally in Great Britain, then you will need to have checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland to make sure that hormone-fed US beef does not get into Northern Ireland. And that would not require a wholesale change of standards. Although I think, I mean, definitely some part of the government are quite keen on a lot of US standards. So we'll see where that goes. But I think there's a big difference between we're starting to see a lot of discussion. We've got this big Tiger report led by Ian Duncan-Smith on the type of new regulatory policy that the UK should have, the type of approach to standards. It's still very, very early days. And I think a lot of this is very ambitious plans that are not then going to amount to much in practice. But they are enough to kind of make the EU worry of the risk for divergence and so the need for checks.
Okay. I suppose one thing to just pick up from the opinion poll that we did ask the question as to the extent to which voters in Northern Ireland would support the idea of closer regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU in order to minimise or reduce the checks and controls on movements from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. I think we had 57% indicating that they supported that. We had 38%, however, disagreeing. Sorry, no, it was 36% disagreeing, which is up from March. So continued support for the idea of regulatory alignment, but a significant increase in the amount of opposition to it as well. Okay, we've got a question there from George. How did Gibraltar sort out Brexit-related issues? I'm not too sure any of us can claim any expertise on Gibraltar. I think what we might have to do, George, is see if we can point you in the direction of something in due course on that. I know a good number of the issues have been addressed. I think there's one argument is that the Gibraltar government took a slightly more pragmatic approach to the resolution of issues.
The last,
Lisa.
I claim no expertise, but just that in the last week, there has been discussion about a potential upcoming agreement that would be added on to the protocol on Gibraltar between the UK and Gibraltar on managing Brexit issues. That is the extent of my knowledge. I don't even know the details of what that agreement will be and or how it might be implemented. So yeah, that's, I can.
Thanks. Okay, we've got a question in there from Michelle. Are there any proposals for Regulatory Cooperation Council with a focus on SPS? What's being done for preventing TBT, good standards and digital? Vivian, have you got any comment you can make here?
I haven't heard anything. I mean, I think it's really important to remember that indeed under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, you've got possibility to actually discuss regulatory cooperation. For now, it hasn't been announced that yet. I think there hasn't been much appetite for it in London, but I may be wrong on this. But it would definitely be a really interesting way of, again, as with the protocol, just using the tools that are legally available to de-escalate and to just find common solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming through, which, unless there are, I don't know if any of my colleagues want to add any further comments. If not, I think what we can say is we've saved you 15 minutes, which will give you plenty of time to at least start on either our report on the opinion poll findings or the summary of the judicial review judgment, which has now been published. We posted the links to both of those in the chat there. But given there are no other questions, let's call this to a close. Thanks ever so much, everybody, for coming along this afternoon and for the questions you have put to us. We do hope that what we've been discussing has been of interest and of use to you. As I say, the reports are there. or the report is there on the public opinion and also on the summary of the judicial review. We're going to come back together, hopefully in the autumn, to do a follow-up to this and look at some of the issues which are on the agenda. Then, as I said earlier, we've got the end of the various grace periods coming in September, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of politics around the protocol then as well. So yeah, we look forward to that. Hopefully we may be in person. We shall have to see. But until then, thanks so much again for coming along today, and enjoy the summer months. So thank you very much.